So, you guys really like the Bruce Lee review I've put out. I don't know if you actually like it. I just know everybody watches it. So, I'm going to do part 2. Hi, my name is Joe, and welcome to my YouTube channel where I review martial arts books and talk about other martial arts related subjects. Today, I'm going to do Bruce Lee's Fighting Method, Volume 2, as a book review. So I've already done Volume 1. It was one of my first ever YouTube videos, and I'll go ahead and bring up here what I could only put in the notes last time. Insofar as order goes, Volume 2 actually works pretty well as a Volume 1. Luckily, Black Belt has recently put out a compiled volume, and what was Volume 2 in the original, which was the part on physical conditioning and preparation, that is now Volume 1. So it was originally published in 1977, and Bruce Lee died in 1973. So how was this possible? Well, as it turns out, in 1967, he had actually taken a series of photos and was planning on putting out a book on martial arts. He decided against that. The intro says that he was concerned that so many people would say that they taught Bruce Lee, and he didn't want to really give anyone else the opportunity to cash in on his fame, I guess. Man, hindsight's 20/20, huh? Anyway, so this book was put out. Mr. Uehara, as I understand it, wrote most of the actual text based on things that Bruce Lee talked about and a lot of his notes that he had, because, again, he had originally intended to put out a book, just never got around to finishing it. So the very first chapter is largely on the physical conditioning side, and it's got sections on aerobics and warm-ups. I guess it doesn't really go into warm-ups that much. It's got a section on flexibility and stretching, and it's almost like there isn't much of a separation between the idea of warm-ups and flexibility. These days, maybe that wouldn't go over so much. You're not supposed to stretch your muscles when you're cold, and like warm-ups are a separate thing. But anyway, that was included. And he's also got a section on ab exercises, including famous dragon flag exercise. So all of this goes into how important having a foundation in physical conditioning was to Bruce Lee. It's mentioned here that he often ran hills, and actually talks about his running routine for a bit of detail anyway. So he would vary his pace. I think that's interesting. It also talks about how he would skip rope, and how 10 minutes of skipping rope is equivalent of 30 minutes of running. I'm going to try to find any sort of source to actually back that up. If I do, I will try to cite it in my little show notes that usually show up below me. But if not, I'm going to go ahead and say that's unverified. Anyway, but yeah, once he gets the basic, fitness stuff underway. There are more later in the book. But, warm up and work on your abs and get your cardio down. Now, we're going to show you how to fight, because the next section is on stance. And he's very, very much about having a proper stance. He goes over the improper types of stances, like keeping the feet too close together. And, the next section after that, of course, is footwork. Stance and footwork go hand in hand. A lot of this footwork in this particular section is linear, and I think that might be the fencing influence. I know he read some Aldi, and I think one of his brothers, I don't know how many brothers he had. He had a brother who was a fencer, and Bruce Lee got interested in Olympic-style fencing. So again, a lot of the footwork is very linear, although there is some variety to it in that regard. And there's also parts of here where he talks about head movement and, well, upper body movement. Following that, there's a chapter on power. And this includes some biomechanical stuff like how to throw a good punch or kick with power. But a lot of it talks about training on different types of striking apparatuses. Apparati. I don't know what the plural of apparatus is. Anyway, so this includes things like heavy bag training, kicking a shield. I'll have to verify it, but there's some talk that Bruce Lee was one of the first people to use like a shield for kicking. And there are also sections on a few different exercises like trunk twisting to build up that rotational power. Things like working on your grip so you'll have, strong fist when you punch. There's a sort of wrist roller exercise to help build up the forearm, again, to have a strong fist. And then there's a chapter on speed. The chapter on speed covers a few different exercises, and again, some biomechanics on top of that. One interesting thing for me to note in this section is that when he's showing the finger jab, he'll stack his fingers on top of one another. That's not necessarily common in traditional martial arts, and I'll go ahead and throw up some pictures here to compare, but I personally just think that that's an interesting touch. I kind of like it because you're reinforcing the striking surface. So to test your speed, you do it with a paper drill where you're trying to strike the paper that's hanging to the point where you can actually split it. There's working out on the reflex bag or double end bag, which is one of my favorite striking apparatuses because it moves and you got to follow it. It'll hit you back if you're not careful. And he also does a little bit of pad work in here on how to use different types of pad work in order to build up your reflexes. And again, this section has a bit on the different biomechanics of throwing, again, proper strikes. So that's going to be throughout the chapters on speed and the chapter on power. You'll also see the Wing Chun exercise Chi Sao show up a few times in this book, and he talks about that in terms of building up sensitivity and also understanding balance. There isn't a whole lot of text given on it, but because it shows up in at least two different sections, it is worth mentioning. And finally, there's a lot on especially the earlier exercise section on, Bruce Lee used to do this, Bruce Lee used to do that. And you can tell that, unfortunately, this is not a book that was directly written by Bruce Lee. It was his brainchild, and he had started on it, but other people needed to finish it. So it's not literally Bruce Lee telling you how to do things. This is somebody else telling you what Bruce Lee did. So, pros and cons. On the pros side, I really like how informative the book is on biomechanics, and I also like its emphasis on fitness, although I would quibble with sort of the organization of it, and I think that some of it would probably need to be updated. It was created from the 60s into the 70s. We know a bit more about exercise science now than we did then. At the same time, Like I said, it does serve as a pretty solid platform for the foundations of Zhongfan Jeet Kune Do. Now, as far as the cons go, honestly, there aren't a lot. You know, as I mentioned, I think the conditioning should probably be updated, although by the same token, Bruce Lee was sort of ahead of his time when it came to that stuff, and there is a lot of good information to be gleaned there. I also think, in general, the conditioning section could be a bit longer, but overall these are very minor complaints in the grand scheme of things. So, who would I recommend this to? I'm actually a pretty big fan of this. I think if you are primarily seeking to train in Jeet Kune Do, you know, especially when he starts going over, you know, proper stance, and this is how Bruce Lee wanted you to stand. This is the footwork Bruce Lee wanted you to use. This is how he wanted you to throw punches and kicks. I think in light of that material, it's very useful for a practitioner of Zhongfan Jeet Kune Do. I think in general, if you want to have a martial arts specific fitness program, there might be better resources, but this isn't a bad one. And finally, I think, frankly, if you're just sort of a fan of Bruce Lee, again, there are better resources that talk about the actual exercises he did and his various routines. And I think one of his biographers, John Little, has put out, you know, in various forms, like, this is how Bruce Lee was exercising. But this also has a bit of that in there. So again, if you're a fan of Bruce Lee and you want to understand his fitness routine a little bit better, this would also be a pretty good resource for that. Anyway, that's all I have for this week, and I look forward to talking to you guys next week. Thank you.